This is a post-interview introduction to the Mediasplainers podcast, episode 2. This podcast is approximately 2 hours long, but it can be divided into 2 segments, which may be especially useful for people who do not wish to listen to both hours or have a specific focus in which style they like here more. The first segment, approximately an hour long, as is the second segment. The first segment is basically a monologue with Cathy Young, where she did most of the explanation. The second segment is more of a conversation, where we both angled the discussion, more so than the first hour. There were some errors with the podcast, particularly involving Audacity, which seemed to cause a memory crash that crashed the entire computer at one point, which at least seems the most likely cause. So there were a couple compensations involved there with pausing the podcast, saving into separate files. But for the most part, these transitions are barely noticeable. I once referred to Bill Kristol as Bill Christoph, which is regrettable, but it happens. And there's some minor background noise. I'm not really sure why, but it's there. For the most part, however, I'm quite satisfied with this podcast. I will be offering timestamps to show when these 2 segments begin, so you don't have to search through the entire podcast on your own looking for them. And I hope you enjoy. I plan to do more of these podcasts in the future. And as a side note, there may be a few minor interruptions here or there as to the microphone cutting out, but for the most part, it's on point. Episode 2 of the Mediasplainers podcast, and on this episode, Cathy Young will be the guest. She writes for Reason, Washington Post, Real Clear Politics, The Daily Beast, and The New York Observer, which is quite a resume. She also has 2 books, Growing Up in Moscow, Memories of a Soviet Schoolgirl, and Ceasefire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality. Now, I'm not doing this on my typical campus space, and I just finished basically being sick, so admittedly, I might not be at 100% full performance, but we're going to give this a go, and I'm going to allow Cathy Young to introduce herself a bit here.
Hi, first of all, thanks very much for having me on the podcast. I really enjoyed your the first one that you did, so I am very much looking forward to this. And thank you for the introduction. I write for a lot of different places, but I don't think we really want to do a full list. But those are the main ones right now. And I guess one thing that I want to say is that I do a lot of writing on gender issues, and I write from what I consider to be a kind of dissident feminist perspective. I am, definitely not a traditionalist. I am very much in favor of gender equality. I'm very much in favor of the sort of women's new roles. But I have a lot of issues with where feminism has been going, not just in the past, 4 or 5 years, but really even going 20 years back. I mean, I wrote Ceasefire back in 1999. It was published. I started writing it in 94. And really looking back, it's just kind of amazing how much of what I was writing about is still very relevant today. Except, if anything, the dialogue, if you want to call it that, is even more acrimonious and more kind of divisive because, of course, the internet kind of magnifies everything. And, one thing that has happened is that now a lot of the time, it seems to me that the conversation on gender issues consists of finding a tweet that some idiot wrote on on the internet, and then it just becomes people grab like 3 or 4 really idiotic tweets saying something horrible about women, and then it's everyone is a misogynist and this is what people say about women on the internet. No, it's not really what people say. It's what, 4 or 5 trolls say. And then I think a lot of the people on the men's rights side kind of do the same, where they find some completely nutty blog post by some woman saying, sexual intercourse is always rape, and then it's like, oh, feminists say, well, I disagree with feminists on a lot of things, but it's not really a standard feminist view that sexual intercourse is always rape. So, I just kind of do my best to inject a little sanity into this conversation when I can, and a lot of the time I get called names for it by both sides, but I think you really need to kind of have a thick skin in this business. And actually, one thing that we could talk about if you want, one issue that I've written about a lot is this issue that has been, very exhaustively discussed, of online harassment of women, which honestly, I feel terrible for anyone who gets death threats, or anyone who gets serious abuse and threats of, not to mention things like people get with the swatting thing, right, where they call 911 and they drive.
Yeah.
That's horrible. I know that this has happened to people, not just women, by the way. And, that's really, really awful. And I do think that we should have a better law enforcement response to that. But it really, really worries me that we're now having a number of people basically say that there should be some kind of legal response or some kind of law enforcement response to people saying mean things to you on Twitter. And I think that's kind of idiotic. That's, it's very, very unconstitutional, I think, if we look at the First Amendment. Obviously, Twitter as a private corporation has the right to police its own conversation in any way that it sees fit. But I would say that even some of the action that we've seen from Twitter recently, I do think is kind of worrying. I think that given that Twitter has kind of built up its image as this public square for free speech, I think it is kind of worrisome where people, and some of those may be very obnoxious and unpleasant people, but nevertheless, when people essentially get booted from Twitter for expressing obnoxious views without really threatening or harassing anyone, I do think that that's worrying. And a lot of that is happening in the name of feminism. I see people essentially making these very kind of paternalistic arguments that, you can't really say nasty things to women because, women apparently are more fragile than men. I don't want to brag about my own, endurance here, but I've had recently, I've written about the so-called alternative right in a not very flattering tone, and I've had, basically people with neo-Nazi stuff in their profiles tweeting stuff at me like, deport the Jews. And it's really, really bad. But there is this wonderful thing called the block button, or the mute button even, where you can use it to get rid of those people and not really see them in your mentions again. And, I realize that it can be really unpleasant, but I really don't think that we're entitled to a pleasant experience on the internet, especially if we're right about controversial things. I don't think this is a women's issue. I know guys, and I've written about this, who have really had awful experiences and I do think that, again, there should be more of a response to this kind of thing, where, for instance, they become the target of these slanderous rumors that on the internet, stemming from a blogging fight that leads to them losing their job, or that, results in a false report about them to Child Protective Services. I know a guy that had that experience. where, again, stemming from a, oops, sorry,
Try this. Okay. You could
okay.
you can continue.
Okay, so yeah, and I think that it can be a deterrent to people, blogging or participating in conversations on Twitter if they know that someone can go after them in this way. I mean, there are certainly women who've had. I mean, if somebody tweets at you, a death or a rape threat with your home address in it, that is when you really start worrying, and that is when I think that there should be a better and stronger law enforcement response. Uh, but I really think that we need to distinguish between genuine harassment and again, people saying nasty things to you on the internet. I wrote recently about this Canadian case of a guy named Gregory Allen Elliott who certainly did not behave very well. I mean, he got into this big Twitter fight with a couple of feminist activists. He said some really nasty things to them. He continued tweeting at them for a while after they told him to stop. On the other hand, if you look at their behavior, he actually, one thing that I only realized when I started looking into this case is that he did at one point stop tweeting at them, and there was a kind of truce between them for a couple of months, which they then broke by tweeting something nasty about him because they saw what they thought was him hitting on an underage girl, which was not really the case. So, and then he gets arrested for harassment, and he first of all was under a court order that banned him for I think almost 3 years
Yeah.
for using the internet, which really devastated him financially. He was in danger of going to prison. So, I mean, yeah, I think that the issue of internet harassment is a real one, but it just gets used in ways that that I think are very, very disturbing if you care about freedom of speech online.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all of that. Uh, People don't often take into account that when you enter a private business in the physical world, there's a lot of times risks involved that you might have to sign a waiver for or
Oh
otherwise.
yeah, oh
But
yeah,
they act like when it comes to Twitter, it becomes a purely law enforcement or a purely business side to all harm done. But
right.
it doesn't work that way if you were to deal with physical businesses. It almost always falls somewhere in the middle. Like you're responsible for a certain amount of harm that can be done to you, which I
Oh yeah,
think
yeah.
which follows under like I think basic criticism and even mean comments. But
Oh, of
it
course,
just
of course.
but of course if you go into a swimming pool or maybe some other private example
Right, right.
that's not coming to mind, and the water's filled with E. coli, there's gonna be a big difference there between whether or not it's oh well you signed a waiver when you entered the pool. They're
Yeah.
always it's not one or the other, and that's
Right. No, that's a very good point. And I mean, the social media do have this weird status where, they're private corporations, but they're also kind of viewed as a public square right now. And I think a lot of that is rhetoric, but I think people really do kind of expect it to function as a public square. And then you get the question of, do we expect Twitter to be politically neutral in enforcing its rules? And, is it really a problem, for instance, if conservatives get banned from Twitter more than liberals do for, saying nasty things to somebody, which a lot of people have claimed is the case. Now, again, if Twitter wants to say, yeah, we're a liberal company and we're gonna give more latitude to liberals than we do to conservatives. That's their right, but of course that is going to create all sorts of problems with, I do think one of the good things about Twitter is that people do mix with people of different political leanings and, viewpoints. One thing that really concerns me about the current landscape of political discourse is that there is a very strong tendency for people to self-segregate into these echo chambers, where really the only people you talk to generally are people who agree with you, 95% of the time. And that has certainly happened in the blogosphere. Most blogs are very clearly, one way or the other in their ideological leanings, and blogs that have comments, most of the commenters will be of a particular outlook. And in fact, if you come in there espousing a different outlook, you may be accused of trolling just for doing that. Twitter is a place where people really do mix with people of different opinions. And I think if Twitter gets the image of this kind of left wing biased place where people with conservative views are at a disadvantage, what you're probably going to have is someone trying to set up a kind of parallel Twitter-like social media vehicle for conservatives. I think a couple of people are already trying to do that. So far, it hasn't really been very successful. But, I really hope that that doesn't happen, because we really don't need any more fracturing and any more sort of echo chamber segregation in our political discourse. So, I very much hope that, Twitter gets its act together, because I've seen some recent stories that really make me feel that the rules are not being fairly enforced.
I think the companies feel the rules are being fairly. Well, to be fair, I'm not 100% sure how much like social justice types actually believe that they are enforcing the rules 100%. But in general, a lot of a lot of liberals are completely non-compromising on basically any conservative viewpoint. It seems that they treat every single point as that is correct as the antithesis of conservative. So
right. No, and
to view them as fair, I think in that sense, to a lot of liberals are so biased though that the only thing fair is the liberal perspective. So if they were to try and be fair, they'd always side with the liberal perspective against the conservative perspective.
Yeah, because the conservative perspective is kind of inherently seen as oppressive, unfair, etc. And I think that really bleeds into the discussion of things like, abuse on the internet. I've seen, I saw last fall, I think there was a roundtable discussion on the Wired website.
Yeah.
And it was basically several activists talking about online safety. And Del Harvey, who's the Twitter president for Trust and Safety, was one of the discussants. And it was just fascinating because the entire kind of tenor of the discussion was based on the assumption that the primary concern should be to protect sort of social justice activists and so-called marginalized people. And I think when you have that kind of explicit bias going in, I have real concerns about, what happens if you actually do get harassed on the internet by somebody who belongs to a marginalized group, and they believe that they're doing this in the interest of social justice because, they see you as the enemy. And I think it is kind of useful to remember that, there's been a lot of accusations leveled at Gamergate, which is a very controversial group, obviously, where they've been accused of harassment. And a lot of the time it's not really threats or anything. It's more, what people call dogpiling, where you have like a bunch of people going after one person and just kind of tweeting at them to argue or to, sometimes to say kind of nasty things to them if that person has said something that they find offensive. What people don't really uh, think about is that I would say it's probably the social justice people on Twitter who really kind of pioneered dogpiling as as a weapon of as a tool of social change, or what they believe to be social change, because they have this habit of going after people who've crossed the line in some way and said something that is deemed to be racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic, whatever.
Yeah.
And and I think that is where, again, where I think we kind of lose perspective. It's there's a lot of blindness about, and it's probably on both sides of every issue. I think there's a lot of blindness to bad behavior on our own side, which is something that I really try to avoid. And I don't know if I'm always successful, but I strongly believe that at the very least you should kind of try to look past your own biases. And I think a lot of people today don't even really believe that. I mean, they think it's perfectly fine to kind of approach public discourse as a kind of, war by any other name. So, it's kind of like take no
Yes.
prisoners. You don't really even try to be fair. Or you just see the other person as the enemy, and any weapon that you have handy is good. So,
And,
that really distresses me.
and shame is one of the easiest weapons
Oh, of
to
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
use,
Yeah.
and that's how it all basically started. Even it's just managed, I think, because of Twitter, to go more direct rather than kind of conversational, indirect maliciousness and
Right, right.
attacks. Now you can just at the person, and you can bring the shame to them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I think, that is the real sort of downside of Twitter because, on the one hand, I think it is kind of great that, as a writer, for instance, I have the kind of contact with I can have a kind of public conversation with my readers that really wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. On the other hand, this kind of access also means that anyone who wants to yell at you for saying something that they didn't like can do it, and can publicly attack you and troll you, and so I think it really does contribute to a kind of nastiness. And again, I think that it's something that you should be able to deal with if you're a grown up, especially writing about controversial issues. But it certainly doesn't contribute to productive conversation.
And there's definitely, I'd say, there's a heightened sense of self righteousness that's been going around because
Oh, no kidding.
it it's so there's so much. People become more and more sensitized. It's not a desensitizing effect to having all this constant news flow and having almost everyone's interactions framed for
Oh,
years
yeah.
to come in articles
Right,
rather
right.
than lost to the second, third law of entropy or whatever. Just
Yeah, that's no, that is that's a very good point. And I do think that there's something very, very wrong about this culture of just pouncing on anything that people say and kind of analyzing it to death and putting it in the worst possible light. Um, it's really almost like you know, I actually posted a few months ago the scene from that I translated from a Russian novel that takes place in the Stalin era, in which a person has been called before a Communist Party committee, sort of called on the carpet, for uttering, for making a comment that is completely innocuous on its face, but that somebody interprets as an insult to the Soviet government. And, and it's kind of a scene that's really very darkly funny and horrible, where every word that he says and everything that he says trying to kind of explain himself is twisted and turned against him, and it just everything is completely blown out of proportion, and then everything he says just causes him to kind of get deeper and deeper in,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's kind of a tragic comic scene because I mean, it basically like it ends with him dying of a heart attack because he's just so completely terrorized, and suddenly there's the prospect of him not just being expelled from the Communist Party and losing his job, but going to the gulag. Now, obviously, when you're on Twitter, you're sometimes I mean, people have lost their jobs over things that they have said on the social media. You're usually not in danger of losing your job, though, and you're certainly not in danger of going to prison. But I mean, people have been kind of targeted by these shaming mobs in ways that I find really kind of repugnant, and I mean, you see, like, even when people have done something wrong, like, I don't know if you followed the couple of years ago, the Hugo Schweizer. So Hugo Schweizer was a male feminist gender studies professor in California, and he was kind of disliked by a lot of people on the feminist side because they saw him as too pro-male, and they were kind of suspicious of a guy writing about feminism and gender studies in any case. And a lot of the men's rights activists didn't like him because he was a feminist. And he also had this past of that he very openly wrote about, of having had a lot of kind of promiscuous relationships that he himself, I think, said were exploitative toward women, and in some cases. And he sort of presented himself as this reformed guy who had become a feminist and was happily married in an egalitarian relationship. So then he was caught, I think, like sexting in an extramarital relationship that he was having with a sex worker, and it just kind of it ended up being all over Twitter, and then it kind of came out that he was also having sex with some of his students, and really, I mean, in some ways, it was really almost like this sort of parody of the male feminist who is using feminism to get laid. Yeah. I mean, you really couldn't make it up. I mean, at one point he actually led a slut walk, and I mean, it's like, okay, so a sex addict leading a slut walk, like, this is too good to be true almost. But
if his position were reversed,
because it was also pretty clear that the guy had some really serious mental health issues, and in the middle of all this, he ended up resigning from his job. He also had this very kind of public mental meltdown, where at one point he just took to Twitter and was tweeting a lot of these sort of very self-loathing, self-flagellating messages, and these people, like these social justice people who hated him, I mean, they were basically making fun of him. They were saying things like, oh, well, I guess the white male ego is fragile. And I'm like, what's wrong with you? I mean, this person is, I may disapprove of a lot of stuff that he's done, but he's a human being who is, who's very, very obviously in a lot of emotional distress. And I mean, it's just really, really horrible. And I mean, the lack of once you start showing a complete lack of humanity and compassion for people on the other side who are suffering, and we're not talking about Osama bin Laden here. I'm not asking anyone to have compassion for his suffering. If you're about someone responsible for the deaths of hundreds or thousands of people.
Of course, there's more than enough liberal sympathy for Osama.
But if we're talking about ideological disagreements and possibly questionable behavior, which I think probably most of us have engaged in at some point in one way or another, if you start treating people as these pawns in political battles, You really, I think, need to kind of sit down and seriously reconsider your belief system and your value system because, I really don't think that you should ever lose sight of the humanity of people on the other side of the political divide. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes the social media kind of encourage us to do that, I'm afraid.
Aside from the fact that he was in an extramarital relationship, the rest of that sounds though like if he were a woman, he'd be a woman power figure, a feminist power
Oh yeah,
figure.
no, and I often actually have wondered how this would be different
Like,
if the genders were reversed. And I had the same issue with the whole Zoe Quinn story that started Gamergate. I mean, I understand that Zoe, this is the woman who the feminist game developer who was the subject of a lengthy internet post by her ex-boyfriend who said that she was sort of emotionally abusive in their relationship and repeatedly deceived them about having sexual relationships with other people when they were supposed to be in a committed monogamous relationship. And she was very, very widely seen as the victim. And I mean, Gamergate kind of spun out of the discussions of this and of her parents' relationships with some people in the gaming press being censored on various boards and blog sites, and that kind of blew up into Gamergate eventually. And I mean, Zoe Quinn was widely seen as this, victim of sort of slut shaming and victim of harassment. And I mean, yeah, I know that she was the target of some really, really bad things. I think she was doxxed, and there were some threats that were sent, I think, not only to her but to her family. And I mean, there were some horrible things that were written about her. I mean, a lot of people didn't like her because she was this very self-righteous sort of social justice person. And, some people said really, really nasty things about, like, wouldn't it be great if she killed herself? I mean, again, we have the same problem of seeing the person on the other side as a non-person, as, someone whose mental anguish really doesn't count. But, I was wondering how this would have played out differently if this was a male game developer, especially since the reason that the boyfriend, Aaron Gianni, said that he made this post was that Zoe was this big sort of social justice person who was very, very emphatic about having ethical relationships. And in fact, she had this idea, which I think is kind of, really taking it too far, but that was apparently her view. And he had some chats where they were discussing this, where she believed that if you are supposed to be in a monogamous relationship and you're cheating without your partner's knowledge, you are essentially guilty of rape, more or less, if you have sex with your partner, without them knowing that you're cheating, because that's a violation of consent, because they consented to being in a monogamous relationship, and therefore, if you're cheating on them and you're sort of having sex with them under false pretenses. Now, I mean, I think it's really, really a stretch to call this non-consensual.
but
It's not any more of a stretch than a lot of the stuff that goes on college campuses today, but I do think it's ridiculous. But that is why he felt that she was being a hypocrite, and that she was really acting contrary to her stated principles. Again, imagine if this was a male feminist game developer who was being, who was a social justice person, who was being accused by his girlfriend of violating his own principles of ethics and relationships and behaving in what she considered to be abusive ways. I mean, I think that there would be a totally different reaction. I think there would be a lot of people who would think that that was a legitimate subject for exposure. There's been a lot of, in recent days, sort of related to Gamergate, there's been a lot of discussion of these sort of witch hunts. I don't know if you've heard about the whole Allison Rapp.
yeah, we've discussed that before.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think there's a little we could even get into
Right.
soon.
It's a really convoluted story, so I don't really want to get into that. But
Fair
it's a
enough.
woman who who lost her job, possibly because of being targeted by Gamergate and having some things exposed that, caused them. She was a Nintendo PR rep, and like some of the things that got exposed because of Gamergate going after her apparently caused her to lose her job.
So
And
the official
there are
story
a
or
lot
something like that.
there are a lot of people who are really aghast and who are saying that this is like basically personal destruction, and it sort of shows this pattern of intimidation. But I really do have to wonder, where were those people when this kind of thing happened to a number of people who were targeted by the social justice crowd? I mean, there was, for instance, just to give you one example off the top of my head, which I thought was really, really bad. There was a journalist named Josh Mattingly, who was actually, I think, one of the co-founders of a site called Indie Static. And he was apparently, like, one evening, this was several years ago, he was depressed after recently losing his brother. He was very, very intoxicated. And he started having a chat with this female, I think she was a woman who worked with some tech company. And I think he originally contacted her for a comment for some story. And then, being very drunk, he kind of he went from being very mildly flirtatious, and he apparently knew her personally, to just, admittedly saying like wildly inappropriate things. I mean, like it just went, it just completely got out of control, and he basically sort of propositioned her in a sort of semi-jokey but really, really crude way. And then she initially posted screenshots of this without revealing who the person was. There was a huge to-do, and this was taken as an example of, misogyny in the gaming press, because here's this guy who was a journalist talking in this really blatantly sexual way to a female tech company employee. And, he immediately apologized and basically said that, yeah, he was extremely drunk and depressed, and, I think his brother had committed suicide. And, and basically his career was over because of this one incident, which, did not involve not only any physical harassment, but any sort of, say, quid pro quo, where he said, if you don't sleep with me, I'm going to write something bad about your company or something like that. I mean, he behaved very inappropriately. Yeah. I mean, I think that if this was me, I would probably, privately send the guy a message saying, like, if this ever happens again, our professional relationship is over, and, please don't do this again, because, this could get you fired. But this is like, this one incident completely destroyed the guy's career. And, and there was a lot of gloating about it. And again, a complete lack of sympathy for the fact that he was going through a very, very difficult time at that moment. So, I mean, the double standard just really, really appalls me. I mean, I think that if we're going to have sympathy for Zoe Quinn, and I think we should, we should also have sympathy for people who have, really bad experiences of being targeted by these social justice lynch mobs. And by the way, I've been told by certain sort of progressive people that you really shouldn't say lynch mob because it appropriates the suffering of African Americans. And, and likewise, I've been told that, you shouldn't say witch hunt because that refers to burnings of women. And, I mean, okay, you know what, really? No one is going to be like actually personally injured from my saying lynch mob in a metaphorical sense. I mean, this does not hurt. I mean, there are a lot of things that really, really suck for Black people in, in this country and in many other places at this moment. I mean, I think that that is absolutely true. And I think that that there are a lot of things that need to be resolved. But you know what? I mean, the metaphorical use of the word lynch mob is really not one of them. And, it's just really one of those examples where, I think the whole kind of social justice thing is completely out of control. And, it just really, one of the things that amazes me, like the extent to which it occupies itself not primarily with real life issues, but with language policing. I mean, you see these language guides on college campuses where they say things like, well, don't say this is depressing because that's, discriminatory toward people with mental health issues. And I mentioned this to a friend of mine who actually has at various times suffered from depression, and she said, that's completely ridiculous. I mean, that's, no person with depression is going to be better off because, people stop saying that's depressing. So, I mean, I just think that this whole social justice scene is really, really out of control. So,
yeah.
And obviously, feminism is one area where this is happening a lot. But we have a lot of stuff going on with regard to racial issues, and of course, it just gets more and more into the sort of proliferation of different identities. So, it's it's kind of crazy, but it's also very unfortunate because I think a lot of this. A lot of these causes have a good kind of underlying goal. I mean, it's, I think gender equality absolutely is a positive value. And I mean, I think that we should be, definitely concerned with some of the men's issues as well as women's issues. But, I really, one area where I really, really part company with a lot of the sort of the men's rights crowd is when they start saying, oh, well, there was really always equal oppression and, women may not have had the right to vote and, may not have had property rights, but, men were the ones who had to go off to war. It's, I think that you really cannot just, I mean, not to say that men had a wonderful time always. I mean, obviously a lot of poor men, had a very, very hard life, probably as hard as women's. But, I don't think that you can really sort of discount the fact that, men did have for a very long time have political rights that women did not have, had property rights that women did not have, and so on. And but I think today, I think we definitely can look at both sides of gender issues. There are men's issues as well as women's issues. I think we have a lot of unfinished business when it comes to racial equality, certainly. And equal opportunity. So I think these are definitely important issues. I mean, I think it's a good thing that we've become more, cognizant of promoting equal rights and equal opportunity for the disabled. These are really good things, But I think when you have these causes kind of hijacked by people who tell you that it's ableist to use the word crazy, that is kind of crazy. It also really, really undermines their own cause and their own goals, and that's really one of my concerns.
Yeah. What's I gonna say? But the problem here is that it's feel good activism, and it's extended into self-righteous feel good activism.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the problem, because it's the same thing with climate change, where they're not really willing to address the real problems. But if they address these much smaller, more inconsequential issues, like going after some word as being ableist, it makes them feel better about themselves, and it also gives them an excuse to condemn others.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of this is about being self-righteous, and I mean, I really dislike the term virtue signaling because it's become such a cliche. I mean, I'm seeing it a lot. It's like from some of the people on the right. It's like anytime that you say something that they consider to be too liberal, I mean, it gets to the point where if you basically say that, yeah, racism is a bad thing, oh, you're just virtue signaling. But there is such a thing. I mean, there is, I think it used to be called moral posturing, and I think that's a much better word, really. I think that obviously, you do get these people who will, who will condemn others, and just sort of strike a pose to demonstrate how sensitive and aware they are. Um, and I think that really does compromise, again, their own causes. Um, but well, even worse is the fact that they are attacking others. It's not just about striking a moral pose yourself. It's about crucifying anyone who has overstepped the bounds of what somebody considers to be appropriate. And
in a sense, you do
really
need those people, though. You do need people. You do need people to be condemned, but what you need also to really progress society is you actually need people who are accomplishing legitimate problems, who are condemned and not just standing in their glass house, like throwing rocks. But that's the difference between, because that's how you get moral progression, is you basically.
Right. Yeah, well, and also, I mean, I think there's a big difference between, condemning something that actually is a kind of intended to be hurtful or, damaging to, some group or some individual, and condemning people for, saying something that somebody interpreted as being offensive. I mean, that's, I think, what a lot of this stuff currently is. I mean, you have these kind of witch hunts that are based on, really somebody using the wrong word, or somebody not being sufficiently sensitive in replying to a question. There was this ridiculous incident the other day with Gay Talese. I don't know if you followed that. This is the writer who,
yeah,
the 84-year-old writer who,
couldn't name a woman who inspired him.
Much to his good fortune, he's not actually on Twitter, so he didn't actually get to see himself being bashed. But, this is a guy who was asked a question about, which women writers inspired you, and he thought that they were referring specifically to his career in journalism and that kind of new style of journalism that he was doing, which not that was kind of much more personal, and which not many women, or hardly any women, were really doing at the time, given again that he's 84 years old, and it was really a much more male field when he started out. And he basically thought about it and said none. And then he kind of tried to explain that, there were reasons that women were really not in this field a lot at the time. And, and then he just, came home from this conference to be told by his wife that he was being trashed all over Twitter. And suddenly there were people calling him sexist. And, it's ridiculous. It's, again, it's not, I mean, I can understand, I mean, I've seen people get kind of, get trashed legitimately for saying something that was, really, really stupid or nasty or racist or, sexist. I don't think there's any, I mean, freedom of speech includes, my freedom to say that, a particular statement is anti-Semitic, for instance, or misogynist. But really, it's it should not devolve into these mobs that go after people for saying the wrong thing. And I don't think it really helps anyone.
If there are anyone mobs should be going after, it should be basically these cultural and moral relativists who will take issue with statements like that, but can't decide whether to issue condemnation on ISIS or Osama bin Laden or...
Oh, yeah. Well, or at least, they'll condemn ISIS, but they will not say that, the particular forms of Islam that require women to be stoned for adultery, which is not unfortunately espoused only by ISIS. And yeah, I don't really have a lot of patience, by the way, for those. There is a kind of all Islam is evil and violent, and all Muslims should be kind of suspect, as potential terrorists. I see that, and I don't really have a lot of patience for that either. But I mean, I do think that there is a big problem with extremism in Islam. I mean, that's kind of undeniable. There are many Muslims who have said that, and who have said that there needs to be a sort of reformation in Islam that would get it away from these, really extreme views. I mean, you look at the polls that are done in some countries like Egypt, where you find something like, 80% of, or close to 80% of Muslims saying that women should be executed for adultery. That's kind of scary. And I think when you have that, I think you really have a problem. Now, again, is it inherent to all Islam? No, because you have other countries in Central Asia, for instance, where the majority of believing Muslims, don't hold those views. But it is a problem, and I think it needs to be addressed. And we have seen some ridiculous incidents in England recently, for instance, where secular or sort of ex-Muslim women like Maryam Namazi have been disinvited from colleges where they had originally been invited to speak to the feminist groups, because these feminist groups were afraid of offending the Muslim Student Society. I think that's ridiculous when you have a feminist campus group saying that you shouldn't have a speaker who is critical of misogyny in Islam because it's offensive to Muslim students. This is not only bad in terms of free speech, but it's also just really wrong-headed in terms of priorities, because, again, we're not talking about somebody going up there and saying, deport all Muslims. This is really nothing like that. It's somebody making a critique of views of women that are very prevalent in many Islamic cultures, and I think that is a completely legitimate subject for discussion. So that's certainly another area where this kind of political correctness has been a big problem.
People love a lot of political correctness, though. Is also people, though, who love moral relativism, and it doesn't just extend to Islam or
of course, yeah,
anything like that. There are reasons why you see people who say like that the U.S. is responsible for every single problem going on in the Middle East, which is just not true, or who try to blame the Iraq War for everything, or to say the U.S. is the worst country on earth in terms of its policies. But again, you're looking at people. These type of people really, really are like their hatred of, as much as I say, like, I hate to sound like the white genocide crowd, but these people have a deep seething hatred, one for anything to do with like white civilization, Western civilization, and basically anything of the sort, which is the basics for a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and I actually agree. I mean, I recently wrote, as you know, a blog post responding to the piece on Breitbart by Alan Bukhari and Milo Yiannopoulos about the so-called alternative right, and I just finished a longer piece on that should be running up on the Federalist soon. Yeah. And I think that I think that the piece is a kind of whitewash, no pun intended, of some really nasty racist and white supremacist groups, and I think that Milo and Dalam are giving them way too much benefit of the doubt in kind of trying to say that, oh, well, they're just trying to be provocative. And, I don't really think that's the case. I think some of the, they kind of mention these alternative right websites without talking too much about their content. If you look at their content, it really, really is pretty wild. There is no way around that. But where I agree with them is where they say that, a lot of this is a backlash against the bashing of white people and the hostility to Western culture. I think that's very true. I mean, just like I think that a lot of the misogyny that you see in the so-called manosphere, and there are some really vile websites that, are full of just horrible
Turn of Kings
women, a lot of that is a backlash against radical feminism. And I think, I have seen people who I think are really, normal, decent, non-hateful people, unfortunately kind of get sucked into some of these really extreme, corners of the internet, because it started with them being really disgusted by the extremism and the kind of hatred of some of the social justice people.
And then they turned into the Stormfront.
And then they start exploring the politically incorrect kind of, parts of the
experimentation.
And then they run into some really bad people, So I think the mistake that that Alan and Marlowe are making in that Breitbart piece is basically by saying, oh, well, it's a backlash against the social justice warriors, so, therefore we should be sort of sympathetic to it. Well, one doesn't necessarily follow from the other. I mean, Nazism was in many ways a backlash against Bolshevism, but that doesn't really make it okay in any way, shape, or form. I mean, a lot of really bad things happened as a backlash against other bad things. That's kind of the cycle of history. And, I think that what we need to do is kind of start restoring a commitment to, respect for human dignity, for everyone as an individual, getting away from these, identity labels. Because really the thing that I thought was really quite striking in the Breitbart piece on the alternative right is that they're really quite openly saying that, these are guys who basically want identity politics for white people. And, my response is like, oh, great.
Yeah.
So basically, we complete the circle of oppression Olympics by having the straight white guys join in. That is something, obviously I'm being quite sarcastic here. But, I think what we need is to start getting away from that. And, I absolutely agree that a lot of this is promoted by the extremes of the ridiculous behavior of the social justice people on the internet. I mean, when you have people being told, oh, shut up, you straight, cisgender white guy, you don't really have any voice in this because you're the privileged. I think that really, that is something that really, really pisses people off, and I think that I'm not saying that that's, an excuse for going off to hang out with white supremacists, but I think especially in the case of young people who are naive and, don't really have a lot of experience with the world and, don't really know necessarily what, white supremacists are, I think it can sort of send them into the arms of some really, really bad people online. And I think we really need to kind of think long and hard about that because, there are many, many ways in which I think the social justice movement, in its current form, ends up really legitimizing or enabling actual bigotry and, whether it's racism or misogyny or whatever. Partly, it does it in really many ways, but one of them, and I think that is something that people really haven't given a lot of thought to, is that, if everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is homophobic, then, these terms kind of lose their stigma. I mean, if you can be called a sexist for, enjoying pictures of girls with large breasts, or liking video games with scantily clad women in them, where if you can be called a racist for I don't know, trying on a kimono in a museum, or wearing a sombrero on Halloween because that's cultural appropriation, the words racist and misogynist really kind of become meaningless. And I think that opens the way for some actual racists and misogynists to kind of sneak in under the cover of, oh, we're just saying outrageous things because we want to, thumb our noses at the guardians of PC.
This is an addendum, essentially, to the previous podcast I had hosted with Cathy Young. And she is here, but it's in this format, we're going to do more of a conversational style. There was nothing wrong with the previous format, but I feel there's plenty of discussion that Cathy would be pleased to contribute to, and I think would be relatively engaging for our listeners. So I am going to do a more conversational format here, and it will not be too excessively formal. But I suppose we shall start here. So you asked me before. I think Christina Hoff Sommers might be a good starting point here, because we discussed this. We discussed this before. You inquired, if it's not too personal to explain, but you did inquire as to the issues I had with Christina Hoff Sommers. Yeah, in a general sense. No, I don't really. It's nothing too serious, in the sense of that I have a major disdain for, say, Nero or Arthur Chu, or perhaps some of these other polarized identity figures. But I do think there's a point where it's not really feminism in the sense of she calls herself the factual feminist, for instance. I do feel there's a point where sometimes it does come across as almost zealous, but it's not really in a feminist sense. So I'll elaborate on this a bit.
Okay.
For example, she's very, very dedicated against the wage gap, which is actually a good point, because it's not 79% or whatever statistics they're thrown around by people like Barack Obama.
Yeah, I think 77 cents to a dollar is the comp we used.
Yeah, that's the figure, I believe.
That comes up again and again.
Which is obviously not correct, and it's been parroted throughout all sorts of feminist media, and all the way to the Barack Obama.
Well, and also in mainstream media.
Yes, and
it does get out.
Corporate companies.
That's the problem, that a lot of the stuff kind of migrates from the feminist blogosphere and women's studies into really mainstream media. So go ahead. Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah. She's totally, absolutely, 100% right that figure is completely misleading. However, it's not the whole story. Just for instance, it's not that I have a problem with that, but I feel sometimes it goes the other way. For instance, Christina Hoff Sommers. If you listen to everything Christina Hoff Sommers said on the wage gap, you'd assume almost entirely it's a myth. But realistically, there's 5 to 6% in that area. Christina Hoff Sommers herself even listed in our PDF from the Manhattan Institute.
Right. That small gap that remains unexplained. Yeah,
and that amounts to essentially 3 to 6 cents on the dollar.
Right.
Now, I do admit that is a significantly smaller amount, and of course it's not obviously on anywhere the same scale as 23 cents lost, which would just be a tremendous failure on the part of society. But 3 to 6 cents is still, that's still a potential issue, and I don't think that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, especially if you get into the higher kind of reaches of pay, that could amount to significant loss of income.
Yes, I would
Yeah, we
agree.
don't know that it's really necessarily discrimination. I mean, it could
Yes.
be
Uh huh.
related to other factors like women not negotiating enough.
Yeah.
There's some interesting data on
That
that.
remaining amount. Yeah.
There's on the fact that women, like when they're asked what their ideal salary is, women tend to name sort of noticeably lower figures than men. So, I think that it may very well be partly a cultural issue, but, not necessarily one of discrimination.
Yeah.
But,
So I agree. There's definitely that possibility. It sometimes feels as though it's either one or the other to an extreme. I don't
yeah,
really I don't really
and I understand that this I think this happens a lot when debate gets really polarized. You
yeah.
almost really don't want to concede anything to the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So that, for instance, when a study comes in that does seem to indicate discrimination, there was an interesting study recently, for instance, I think about 3 years ago, showing that when resumes of a sort of a person starting out in a science field gets sent to, I think, heads of labs and people who are in decision-making positions. There's a sort of fairly small but nevertheless sort of stable difference in the hypothetical female candidate being assigned somewhat lower pay, I think about 10% lower, being described as somewhat less hireable with the same credentials. So, and the interesting part also is that it was, if this was purely bias, it was bias on the part of female as well as male persons who were doing the hiring. So, I mean, there is some evidence, and of course there's also other evidence. I mean, the evidence is really kind of all over the place because there was another study that was done in Science that showed that under certain circumstances, actually a woman is twice as likely to be hired as a man with similar credentials. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of contradictory evidence. But, I mean, I agree with you that there is, across the board, a kind of tendency to want to downplay or kind of dismiss or find a way to disprove, evidence that goes against your point, your side. So, I mean, I think we all kind of fall into that temptation sometimes.
Yeah, I'd agree there. It's nothing too personal against Hoff Summers.
Right.
It's just a little bit of annoyance.
Christina and I have disagreements on some issues.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's of course.
She tends to, in some cases, overstate sort of innate gender differences. I mean, that's she knows that we have a disagreement in that. We've had discussions.
Yeah, I'm not saying you have to agree with.
I mean, I would love to be on a panel with her and talk about this, but I think this is something where I think we can have a sort of civilized debate, and I would.
Yeah, it's not a hostile disagreement, but I think the point, another point though, I want to make a little bit though is, sometimes it feels like the focus should be more on redirecting the conversation rather than sort of dismissing it in any sort of sense like this, because like obviously the 77-cent thing is nonsense, but I feel like in general it's not just a criticism of Summers or anything like that. It's all across the board, but it's not dismissing the problem is sort of one of the issues that sometimes anti-feminists get into, but rather than sort of redirecting, like if you have a falsehood like the 77-cent wage gap, I would redirect that to say basically, okay, this is a false statistic, they're misleading people. If there is a wage gap, that's still a pretty severe thing to look into. So it'd be redirecting into if there is a wage gap, what is it, rather than,
and why does it exist?
Yes, and what? Yeah. So, and obviously that's not just necessarily males who are resulting in this issue. Like, if there is one, which I'm not saying there even is, but I'm saying the focus should be in a sense that justice comes before identity politics under any circumstances.
Yeah, I think partly it's that the kind of the general discourse at this point is still so kind of inundated with identity politics and so inundated with these really incredibly polarizing false claims.
Yeah.
That I think a lot of the time, you do kind of put all of your energy into just rebutting the stuff that keeps, and it keeps coming back. It's like, it's not like, okay, you've done your rebutting,
Hmm.
and then, we can get to the point where we can debate the real statistics and, talk about the problems that really exist and what can we do about them. No, it's, you kind of have to keep making the same arguments over and over again.
Yeah.
I can sympathize. I mean, I think that I agree that there probably should be a kind of recentering of the discussion, and I would love to see that. But I don't think it can happen unilaterally.
Yeah,
So,
of course. But
yeah.
I feel also a little bit that feminists and MRAs they kind of aren't really accomplishing much
Oh,
anymore. They're just deadlocked fighting against each other in these
right.
identity politics wars and
Yeah,
sometimes
it's
misleading
partly,
statistics.
yeah, it's partly sort of internet theater,
Yeah,
basically. It's
but
I mean,
generally there's still a lot of work that can be done both on the feminist front and on percent a male right
oh
activist
yeah, yeah,
front,
absolutely,
especially when you have issues like circumcision, you have issues like disparity in
yeah.
like
I mean,
the
I
way
think,
kids are handled in a marriage. Like there's
oh
lots of
right,
issues that for men that can be solved, and there's some issues still for women that can be solved. But it
of
does
course,
seem like the
yeah.
two are just clashing to
Oh
such
yeah,
an extent that nothing is being
yeah, and I think partly it's
progressed.
that, yeah, partly it's that no one wants to really admit that the other side does have legitimate issues. I mean, feminists tend to, on the one hand, say, well, yeah, men do have certain problems, but it's actually not because of feminism, it's because of patriarchy. And, feminism is actually dealing with those issues. And then, and there's a kind of hypocrisy because then sometimes the same people will say, like, when somebody brings up men's issues within a feminist debate, they will say, well, we're feminists, we're addressing women's issues, so why are you trying to redirect this conversation to men? So it's almost like when it suits them, then feminism is also about men's issues. When it doesn't suit them, then suddenly it needs to focus on women. And I think a lot of, I mean, there's a nugget of truth in like the argument that a lot of these anti-male stereotypes are actually, I mean, I kind of really hate the word patriarchy in the context of modern day American society. But,
Yeah.
let's say sexism, kind of old-fashioned sexism, like some of the issues that the MRAs bring up, like, the fact that domestic violence by women toward men is not taken very seriously. I don't think that's primarily or only because of feminists. I mean, I think that
Of
to a
course.
large extent it is because of these traditional macho norms that, if you're a guy, you really should be able to handle a woman. And, like if you let a woman beat you up, you're not deserving of sympathy so much as you're deserving of contempt because, you're obviously a wimp. So, I mean, I think that to some extent that is due to these traditional views of manhood and womanhood. But, the feminists really have not been very helpful in this area because, there have been a lot of studies showing that, there is, it's not necessarily a 50-50 problem because, there is the fact that even if men and women kind of hit each other at equal rates, yeah, the guys are generally going to do more damage because, they are generally physically bigger and stronger. Um, but, there is a lot of evidence that domestic violence by women toward men is a more serious problem than generally recognized. And, maybe it's not 50% of the problem. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's 25% of the problem. That's still pretty significant. I mean, if
Hmm.
25% of people getting a certain disease, were women, we wouldn't be saying, oh, well, this is a men's issue because, women are only 25% of the of those affected. And we have a lot of feminists basically saying that, bringing up male victims is derailing the conversation or something, or, we're trying to make all sorts of excuses for why female violence is really irrelevant, and really it's only self-defense, which the studies show that it's not. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's, and then on the other hand, you do have some MRAs who discuss this in a very counterproductive way, and who are sort of in this, women are evil gold diggers mode. So that's, there's a lot of that. And, it's very counterproductive.
Yeah, I'd agree. And it's part of the issue is there's so many factions to, say, feminism, or I wouldn't say like MRAs have as many factions, but I would definitely say like the sort of
the manosphere, what's known as the manosphere as a whole. I mean,
that extends further in MRAs, I'd say, in general.
MRAs, you have the more kind of like the pickup artist types, and Bruce V, who is not an MRA. I mean, this is the funny thing, by the way. A lot of the time, like, people get called. I mean, MRA has become this. Well, first of all, it's just become this kind of generic slur for anyone who doesn't really buy hook, line, and sinker into the kind of orthodox feminist viewpoint. Oh, you're an MRA. I mean, I know a lot of people who have got, including myself. And it's funny because I don't know if you know this, but I wrote back in I think 2013, I did a piece about the men's rights movement. And, it was sort of like basically most of it was acknowledging that there are legitimate issues, legitimate men's issues. And then I said, unfortunately, a lot of the groups that are dealing with that, like A Voice for Men, Paul Elam's group, are really not doing it in a very productive way. And they have a lot of really toxic, misogynistic stuff. And then, then I think for about 2 or 3 weeks after that, I was kind of getting bashed by the MRAs a lot. I wasn't on Twitter at the time, so, which was kind of lucky because I kind of shudder to think what my mentions would have looked like. But they were, I mean, they had, I think, like 4 different posts in A Voice from Men where they were bashing me in the comments. And, I don't really care very much, if they want to call me all sorts of nasty names, if it makes them feel better, whatever.
I do agree on A Voice for Men.
Because people, and, after, people throw the MRA thing at me all the time. Oh, you're just an MRA female. No, I'm really not, I'm sort of very much my own person. I'm, I'm really concerned about issues and not labels. I mean, if the MRAs are right about something, I'm going to agree with that. If the feminists are right about something, I'm happy to say they're right. So, anyway.
I'd agree on A Voice for Men. I'd say that's probably one of the most toxic forms of like MRA culture. I don't think it's generally anywhere near representative, but it's definitely one of those things. Like the accounts on Twitter, like take down MRAs. They focus a lot on like Jack Barnes MRA, like the worst, most toxic example you could possibly find.
Well, again, I think everyone does that to some extent. I mean, the thing that really bugs me that a number of people in the sort of men's issues community do is they will find, and there are very, very legitimate reasons to criticize, a lot of things that are being said by feminists who today are sort of mainstream feminism, like, say, Jessica Valenti or, Amanda Marcotte. But they will find some obscure blog post that was read by, 5 people that says, all penis to vagina intercourse is rape. And then they will be like, well, this is what feminists believe. No. I mean, there's like maybe like 0.1% of feminists who may believe that, and you don't really, I mean, there are very legitimate reasons to criticize, mainstream feminism today. But this is not one of them. I mean, this is not a feminist view in any widespread sense of the word. So, yeah. So, but of course, do you mind my going on for a little more about this? Because I think...
you can go on for a little more, yes.
So yeah, I mean, one thing that is that happens a lot on the feminist side, well, it happens on both sides really, and this is where Twitter sometimes plays a pretty toxic role. I mean, what will happen is that some idiot will tweet something really toxic and stupid and offensive, either anti-female or anti-male, and again, the other side, like either the feminists or the men's rights people, will do a screenshot of that and run with it and go like, oh well, this is what people are saying on Twitter. It's like I remember that when do you remember when Angelina Jolie announced that she was having a preventive mastectomy because she had I think she had some genetic test done that showed that she was really like at high risk of getting breast cancer. So basically,
no, I don't remember that.
Oh, okay. So anyway, so yeah, she basically announced that she was having her breasts removed, and I mean, I'm assuming that she got implants, but whatever. Anyway, so yeah, there were like maybe 5 or 6, or I don't know, like a smattering of really dumb posts by guys that were saying stuff like, oh, geez, what a waste of humanity, or like, well, I guess, too bad for Brad Pitt, but so it was really stuff like, just really kind of nasty jokes about her breasts and stuff like that. And then there was an article on, I think it was Raw Story. It was one of those kind of lefty feminist-leaning blogs. Maybe it was Jezebel, where they collected those tweets and they were like, well, this is what men on Twitter are saying about Angelina Jolie, having a preventive mastectomy because she's at high risk for breast cancer. I'm like, really? Men on Twitter? Like, 5 jerks are suddenly men on Twitter? I mean, whatever. And that is, I've seen that happen a lot. It's been the same kind of stuff, like when I think there were, in the aftermath of the Steubenville rape case, there were several really offensive tweets that got picked out and, screenshotted, and then suddenly it's like, well, the internet is being really vile about the Steubenville rape victim. It's not the internet. It's like, a dozen or half a dozen jerks on the internet. Why? And I mean, personally, I would just really ignore that kind of stuff because, it's, I really don't believe in amplifying it.
Yeah, if I may interject here.
Occasionally there are times when there are reasons to screen cap a really nasty tweet, but there's I usually do try to leave them alone. Anyway.
Yeah, if I may interject here, I think part of this is it's built on, like you said, like it's a screenshot, but it's really a form of screenshot culture, and it's amplified by journalism because journalism is descending more and more into clickbait, and there's so much opportunity. People continually fall for these screenshots. Like I've seen them evidenced, for example, rape culture. It's just like a bunch of 10 random tweets from people across the world, which is not really indicative of anything. And you'll get like 4,000 retweets, like, oh, as if something were proven. Again, it's like people's intellectual faculties just stop working or something, and they just don't realize that this is not indicative. This is an extremely small percentage. If you had 1,000 or 2,000 tweets, sure, that would be relatively devastating. But when you select a handful of tweets, and to be fair, I've seen it done on people who aren't feminists have done this same sort of tactic as well.
They have the right to the same thing. Like they will pick out, some really dumb, ridiculous tweets by either radical feminists or sometimes trolls posing as radical feminists. And, if it's a tweet that does represent a certain cross-section of feminist opinion, sure, but again, a lot of the time I would actually bet that a lot of those tweets are made by trolls who are, kind of hoping to stir things up and, possibly get a lot of exposure. I think that it's definitely a kind of mutually reinforcing culture of outrage and defense and so on. And everyone does it pretty much on every side. And I mean, I will confess that I've occasionally, there were a couple of times when I retweeted something as an example of, look at the stupid thing some feminists said, and then it turned out that it was actually like a parody post, and I'm really trying to be more careful about that because it's just not to mention that screenshots, by the way, can be altered. I've seen that happen as well. I mean, I've seen screenshots kind of passed around with a couple of words altered in a way that made them sound much, much worse than they actually were. So, you really, really have to be careful what you're getting with this screenshot culture.
Even if you had 0.001% or say 1 in 10,000 people were trolls on Twitter, that could almost evidence basically any argument you want, because
absolutely.
in an environment of millions of users, I believe Adam Johnson, NYC, he did something on the, I believe it's on the color red, and it was, don't quote me on this, but it was something like he wanted to prove basically that like red was the most toxic color in the world or something. And basically it was something akin to that, and he basically just put in a search result for like red is the most toxic color or something, and it come back with like 5 results that he put into a screenshot, and it really showed the point though that you can basically find any random piece of garbage on Twitter, or any silly thought, and there will be tons, or at least enough to form it into some elaborative tweet. Like you can find anything on Twitter, and to evidence your point, it's when you're dealing with such a small, obviously almost no one believes like red is the most toxic color or whatever ridiculous proposition that was stated, but he just took some random idea, and you can turn that into a post. You can make that seem as if millions of people believe this, apparently.
Well, the thing is that there's been a lot of it. I think now it's kind of cooling off because we've all seen the negative side of sort of the internet media. But at one point, there was a lot of excitement among libertarians about the sort of citizen journalism. Now the media belongs to everyone, and so on and so forth. No gatekeepers. And I mean, I think I said sometimes that the great thing about the internet is that anyone can get a platform, and of course the awful thing about the internet is that anyone can get a platform. So it's really very much a kind of double-edged sword. I think that possibly what we're living through right now is kind of the growing pains of the new media, where we're really just learning to sort the garbage, from the worthwhile information. I'm thinking that eventually, this will probably settle into some sort of system with new gatekeepers of some kind. I mean, not gatekeepers in the sense of, being able to keep people from having access to a large audience, but, sort of gatekeepers in the sense of, trusted, sort of like semi-authorities that you can sort of rely on to tell you who can be trusted and who cannot. Because otherwise, it's just, you're kind of drowning in information all the time. And just sorting out the BS from the accurate information is a massive effort, and that's a problem.
I think part of the issue here, a little, is that the subscription model of journalism has pretty much ended, or at least has decreased to such an extent where it's been replaced almost exclusively by ad-driven culture, which is
Right.
also driven by clickbait, because clickbait can be quite effective at bringing in traffic, but
Right. Right.
as probably evidenced by companies like Gawker,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Salon, The Guardian, even though they still seem to be running deficits or having
Right.
trouble with that business model. But
Yeah.
that business model, it probably, at least in the case for a lot of startup websites or websites that don't get a lot of genuine traffic, I know as someone who writes a blog, it's oftentimes difficult to get much traffic.
Yeah.
But a clickbait or an outrage article can do that, where it only takes one post, basically.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's very true, and I think, in a sense, clickbait is really a new version of an old phenomenon. In the old days, they used to have. I mean, that's what tabloid headlines did. They basically do the same thing. They kind of get you to buy the newspaper by putting something really provocative
Yeah.
just on the cover. So there's really nothing new under the sun. But
Correct. I just want to add one thing here, though. When you say that the distinction between tabloid newspapers and credible newspapers is perhaps more than the distinction between a lot of clickbait sources and credible journalism sources, at least in the online culture. For example, you might have a harder time differentiating between The Guardian and the New York Times versus
Right.
some tabloid article you'll see at the grocery store talking about aliens landing, for instance. There seems to be a distinction.
Websites still, have a good or bad reputation. I think that, for instance, Salon has a pretty bad reputation right now. It has really
Correct.
an awful reputation. It has a reputation so awful that I'm rapidly getting to the point of not putting it on my resume that I used to write for Salon, back when it was a very different publication. I think Breitbart, in a different way, has a pretty bad reputation, except among people who, religiously follow it. But, generally speaking, when you show somebody a link and they're reasonably well informed, and like you send them I've occasionally sent people links from Breitbart because I think they do occasionally have some good stuff. I think that Alan Bakari does some good stuff. I as you know, I really was not happy with the piece that he and Milo did on the alternative right. But Alan has done some really good stuff. Milo has done some really good stuff when he's not like deliberately being a jerk. That's I think Breitbart has some good stuff. But, I find myself in a position where if I have to send a link from Breitbart to somebody who is not like a part of their following, I have to add a disclaimer, like, yeah, I know this is Breitbart, but this is actually pretty good. Obviously, same thing with Salon. Salon occasionally publishes good stuff. But again, they have a reputation where the stuff that they publish is going to be viewed skeptically unless it's vouched for by someone believable. So I think reputation really still matters. I would say that one issue with the credibility of the mainstream media is that the mainstream media really, a lot of the time, have not done a good job of even trying to be objective. Especially I think when it comes to sort of the culture wars, issues related to identity politics.
Israel, I would say, is very, very, like, especially the killings in Israel that happen as a result of, say, Palestinian stabbings they don't even try to hide their bias.
Right. Yeah. No, that's definitely one example. I think that on like domestically, in terms of domestic cultural issues, I mean the initial coverage, for instance, of Ferguson, of the shooting of Michael Brown, I think was very. I think it was later admitted by there was an article that somebody wrote for the Washington Post. I forget the name, but he basically admitted that much of their initial coverage was very biased, and where they like the whole hands up, don't shoot thing turned out to be basically mythical. It was proven. I mean, it was still. I still think it was tragic. I mean, I think it's really pretty sickening when you have some of the some people on the right basically go, oh, he was just a thug who got what he deserved. I mean, it looked.
Mm-hmm.
Even if he was committing a crime, this is an 18-year-old kid, who may have been mixed up in some bad things. I don't think he did anything that would deserve capital punishment. But nevertheless, I mean, I think we do know at this point that, this did not go down the way it was initially portrayed. I think that was, that got very bad coverage. I mean, this may not be a hugely kind of national issue, but Gamergate, I think, got really, really shoddy coverage. I've written about that. I mean, I think that the way that some of the sort of feminists in tech, feminists in the video game community, became kind of lionized as kind of martyrs and heroes. I mean, I think that some of them, while I'm sure that they were targets of harassment, they were really not exactly saints themselves, So I think that the coverage of Gamergate was really, really bad. I mean, I can the coverage of campus rape. The way that I mean, I think I did a piece on the mattress girl, Emma Solkovitz, where for a long time she received this completely uncritical coverage, where it was a kind of presumed that she was a victim and the guy that she was accusing was a serial rapist, until I and a few other people did some digging. There are lots of examples. I mean, the initial reaction to like even the Rolling Stone University of Virginia story, I mean, that was initially received in a completely credulous way. And honestly, if it hadn't been for a couple of bloggers, one being Richard Bradley, who's an independent blogger, and then, Robbie Suave, my colleague at Reason, who were really the first to kind of break the silence on the multiple questions surrounding this. I mean, I think a lot of people were kind of skeptical of it, but it's I think a lot of people were kind of afraid to speak out, and I think that there is this, I mean, political correctness is kind of a cliche, but nevertheless, I think that it exists, and I think a lot of people are afraid to challenge it in the media, to kind of go against prevailing dogma on a lot of these issues, and I think that really contributes to lack of trust in the kind of established media, because I mean, something like the New York Times is you're supposed to be able to trust them and to regard them as sort of inherently more reliable than, say, Salon or Breitbart. But on a lot of issues, they're not. I mean, on a lot of issues, they have extremely biased coverage, and I think that is part of the problem. So it's not really just the internet. It's not just clickbait culture. The problem really rests with the media themselves, and that's a problem that's older than the internet. I mean, a lot of these media bias issues were being written about, 20 or 30 years ago. So, that's where we are.
Yeah, I'd agree with most of that. The media is definitely one of the bigger problems. I feel that a lot of the issue with political correctness, but people don't, perhaps even the media, journalists are afraid to go against it, is because in a general sense, I think the liberals are basically winning the culture war against conservatives, where basically conservatives have been beat down so much that anyone's basically afraid to side with them on anything, and especially because liberals have become more, in general, aggressive and hostile to counter viewpoints, especially when conservatives are perhaps a little bit leaning more to the right than they could or should be. So, so basically, they don't want, people just want, people don't want to be harangued, basically, and have this sort of dogpiling on them. And it basically, anytime you side with a conservative viewpoint or anything outside of the current liberal circle, the mainstream liberal circle, you're basically going to get harassed into oblivion, which is actually kind of ironic, since a lot of times liberals do complaining about stuff like harassment, like Gamergate and blah blah blah, supposed harassment.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's another issue that I think has gotten really, really, even outside of the issue of Gamergate itself, the issue of internet harassment is one where I think the coverage, the mainstream media coverage, has been really egregious, because there's a lot this notion that women get very disproportionately harassed and abused on the internet. It's extremely common. It's been reported everywhere. It's been there was this lengthy piece by Amanda Hess in Pacific Standard, and then there was a cover story in the Atlantic, and I mean, a lot of the Washington Post has done a lot of stuff about this. And there's a few of us, like myself and a few other people, who've been trying to counter this with actual studies. I mean, when you look at the Pew Research Center asking people about their actual experiences of online abuse, whether it's verbal abuse, whether it's sexual death threats, you find that, with the exception of sexual harassment, and even there, it's not nearly as kind of skewed in one direction as one would normally think it is. But generally speaking, in terms of, for instance, getting physical threats, it happens to men more than it does to women. It's kind of the best kept secret of what's actually going on online. And I just find that the coverage. There's just a lot of articles about this. That just unthinkingly assume that, the internet harassment is an especially bad problem for women. And, there's, I think a lot of the kind of progressive narrative on internet harassment essentially is about, I don't mean to sound paranoid, but I do think that some of it is about censoring kind of the politically incorrect. I think a lot of it is about protecting online activists who are themselves incredibly verbally abusive toward anyone who disagrees with them. And I think when they encounter pushback, and when people fight back against them, they tend to cry harassment, and I think they themselves may believe that this is what's happening, that they're being harassed, because they don't see what they're doing as harassment. They see it as expressing righteous anger. And when people talk about the horrible things that have happened to Zoe Quinn. I have a lot of disagreements with Zoe Quinn. I have no doubt that she has experienced some really bad harassment. At the same time, I really wish that, the people who are expressing a lot of concern about that would show equivalent concern for people on the wrong side of the political divide, who have also received really bad harassment. you know, I mean, as
Yeah.
much as I am not a fan of Breitbart, I mean, I know that there are people at Breitbart who've received death threats, who have been swatted. You know, this is when somebody calls 911 and, you know, essentially, you know, falsely reports an emergency at your place so that they send a SWAT team, and you know it's a pretty dangerous stunt to pull, and you know, stuff like that. It's happened to a lot of people across the board politically, and when people show concern with that only when it happens to the progressives, that kind of tells me that they're either not doing their homework or they're really biased. So.
I think a lot of it is, though, that a lot of liberals, as much as it may be a generalization, a lot of them are very smug against conservatives, which would be to say that when conservatives get harassed, or generally it's not referred to as harassment. Generally, it's
Right.
like it's this like social justice when they
Yeah,
do
pretty
it,
much.
which is like getting them fired or attacking with aggressive
Right.
dogpiling
Right.
criticism, which is just generally relentless. Like, wow,
Oh
when
yeah, yeah.
liberals go after someone, it's when conservatives pale in comparison when they
Oh, of course.
strike,
Yeah. Well,
because
but it's not even just targeting conservatives. I mean, you know, Joss Whedon, the filmmaker, the guy who made Buffy, and
yeah.
the who's very kind of pro social justice and pro
Hmm.
feminist himself. You know, he left the internet and he sort of tried to, he denied that he was chased off by the social justice people. He kind of said that he left to focus on work, and you know, Twitter was eating up too much of his energy. Which, you know, if true, I can sort of understand that, you know, but I mean, it's certainly a sinkhole as far as you know, time is concerned. But he got really mobbed in very, very nasty ways over incredibly petty things. Like, you know, at one point he made this sort of jokey comment about writing strong female characters, which contained sort of the assumption that a female character will have female genitalia, which
Hmm.
offended a lot of transgender people. And, you know, so he was called a transphobe, et cetera, et cetera. And then he got attacked over some lines in one of the Avengers movies, the plot related to the Black Widow. That was seen as kind of problematic because she was kind of torn apart by the knowledge that she would be unable to have kids, and, you know, because of some experiments that she had been a part of. And that was seen as sort of suggesting that, oh, well, a woman only has worth if she's a mother, which, again, you know, I really don't think that's what Joss was trying to imply. But again, he was called a misogynist, he was called a sexist. I mean, people were tweeting really like very graphic threats of violence against them, and you know, that's not something that you're going to hear about when you hear about internet harassment. So that, I mean, I think that that is something that I mean, if we're going to talk about internet harassment, if we're going to talk about, you know, bullying, if we're going to talk about civility and respect on the internet, I think we need to acknowledge that, because, you know, otherwise it's just going to be this very, very one-sided conversation, and it is going to look like the kind of suppression of politically incorrect speech. So, you know, I mean, I think the social justice warriors really kind of invented the online hate mob. So for them to get all bent out of shape about, you know, supposed online hate mobs that target their own is more than a little hypocritical.
I, to a certain extent, I'm not sure how much they view people who commit these sins of liberalism as actually being among their own. To an extent, I don't think a lot of the social justice sort of authoritarian liberals really view classical liberals as being liberals. I think they just
Oh
view
no, no,
them
they
as a
don't.
new form of conservatism. Well, maybe not even a new form, but just conservatism. Because
Right,
basically any sort of overlap here, like you can be liberal on every single aspect except, say, transsexuality, and you'll
right.
be treated no different than someone like Bill Christoff or any of these other conservatives, you'll get lumped in with them over one issue, even if you're liberal on 99% of everything else you say.
Right.
I don't really think classical liberalism or
No.
these proportionalities. You have to be liberal on every single aspect, or else you're vilified. You're sent to the other side, which is basically conservatives and centrists and classical liberals and basically anyone who doesn't agree to the fullest extent with the new sort of social justice authoritarian movement. And this is saying someone who's definitely very supportive of transsexuality. But it's just these people will pull witch hunts on their own, but basically classify them as outside their own.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And I mean, if you look at, for instance, I mean, especially people who have criticized some of the excesses of the social justice movement, who are liberals, like Jonathan Chait, who writes for New York Magazine. I don't know if you've read his stuff. He's been one of the. I'm sorry.
There's two Jonathans. I keep getting them mixed up, but
okay.
I might have been a little. I follow on Twitter. So.
Yeah, it's Chait. I'm never really quite sure whether it's pronounced Chait or Chait. So you know, I haven't really heard it pronounced many times, but anyway, he's done some really good stuff about political correctness and kind of the backlash against free speech and the kind of the authoritarian tendency in the progressive community. And I mean, the response has basically been to call him a white guy, which, he is, but, but that really is not a rebuttal. And it's just been really very, very dishonest. Like one of his first articles on this, which I think it was sometime last year, the response was basically, oh, well, he's just concerned about the white guys being, called racist, or, were white guys getting, a backlash against saying offensive things. And actually, a lot of the examples in his article were not of white guys. It was, women. It was black people. It was other minorities who were getting a really nasty response and were being personally attacked and kind of denounced as bigots for saying something that went against, some tenet of the social justice creed. So I think, I absolutely agree with you that, for a lot of these people on the cultural left, when you overstep, when you step out of line, when you, transgress on one issue or, dissent from something that is regarded as an essential part of the progressive faith, you're excommunicated. I think you're absolutely right.
I find it a little bit funny, however. A lot of progressive liberals are very much against, say, ableism, which to an extent I get, perhaps more than some issues. I do think there is a lot of ableism that goes around, more so even than sexism, which is to say there's a lot of intelligence shaming, and people just criticized over rather than empathized with. I do think there's a lot of problem with, and basically the whole ableism thing involves basically not judging people over things they have no control of. For example, like being disabled, or perhaps not being up to the most intellectual standards, or which is why they have problems with words like idiots, using words like that, or intellectual slurs. But I find it funny, however, that these people have, so many of them are willing to use white man as a slur.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Which doesn't make much, which goes completely against that, because having a white skin color, having certain like melanin levels, is completely out of one's control. To shame someone for that is basically
No,
equivalent to shaming them for being disabled. It's something they have no control over, but it's consistently used as this shaming tactic or dismissive tactic, which again goes basically against the whole ableism sort of mentality, where
absolutely,
that's wrong to do and shame people.
Right. Yeah, well, in terms of, I've seen this argument, and actually in some of the like more kind of hardcore or more purist sort of progressive communities, people actually have gotten into trouble for referring to their opponents, even to conservatives, as stupid, because that's considered to be an ableist term. I do think that kind of purism really goes a little too far, because I think that it's one thing. I mean, it's not like you're necessarily referring to people's kind of innate intellectual potential. I think you're also referring to their, unwillingness to think. And, I think it really is, not just about innate ability. I mean, it's not quite the same thing to me as, for instance, calling someone, referring to someone as, I don't know, mentioning a physical handicap or mentioning a mental illness. I mean, I think that, for instance, if you attacked someone, I mean, I've seen people, and this is really despicable, I've seen people get attacked because, for instance, they have a history of depression. This is in sort of online wars, and that's really awful. I mean, is it ableist to say, well, that's just a crazy idea? No, I mean, I think, again, that's really, really taking it too far. I think, I mean, that's...
I'm going to have to pause this for a minute.
I think that's just, I mean, it's kind of like there are people who, again, kind of taking it to a real extreme, will say that, oh, well, you're referring to an idea or, an argument as lame is ableist.
Yes, I agree it goes too far.
It's really not. And I mean, I don't think that any actual disabled people are, negatively impacted because you refer to an argument as lame. I've also seen that there was this kind of online campaign at some university, I forget which one, but there was this Facebook page that was like listing a listing of things that you should avoid saying, and one of them was that's depressing. Apparently, because that negatively stereotypes people with depression or something. Well, I mean, being depressed is not a good thing. You don't. I mean, it's one thing to, let's say, dismiss somebody's argument because they have a history of depression, or, paint them as, crazy because they have a history of depression. But, saying that something is depressing really does not invalidate anyone's experience of depression. And honestly, I think that people who are struggling with depression really have far more serious things to worry about than whether someone used depressing as a colloquial, expression for that's sad. So
I need to pause this for a second because I'm getting low on memory.
Okay, and I think we should probably wrap up pretty soon, right?
Okay. Well, maybe we'll just do that. Maybe we'll just wrap up because this is getting low on memory.
Just wrap up, and I mean, if you want me to come back at some other point, I'll be happy to do that. I think we've already discussed.
Okay. Yes, I think that's good for now. We've covered almost an hour here. All right, so. Thank you for being a guest, and this is the Mediasplainers podcast, episode 2 with Cathy Young.
All right, thank you very much. Take care.